Hello, everybody! Can you believe it's already been a year since the Switch 2 launched? Feel free to pause to handle your existential crisis. I've been having a lot of fun with the system so far. I don't have a lot of games that are exclusive to it right now, with that collection mainly being Mario Kart World, as well as Bravely Default HD, which I am currently streaming over on my Twitch and YouTube channel as of the time of this recording. I also have the Nintendo Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4, and I enjoyed it enough. But I've otherwise just been playing my Switch 1 games on the Switch 2. And of course, there's plenty of older games available through the Nintendo Switch Online service, many of which I haven't even played before. I've been making a lot of memories with this system already, so I figured what better way to go over the last year of the Nintendo Switch 2 than by talking about everything you can't do with the system. You can't put your Switch 2 in the freezer. You can't put your Switch 2 in the microwave. You can't shower with your Switch 2. You can't run over your Switch 2 with your car. You can't make your dog play with your Switch 2. Get it? Get the controller. Well, I mean, you could do all of that, but why would you? Now, the topics I'll be going over today will be about all the content in the video games on the Nintendo Switch 1 and Nintendo Switch 2 that you just can't access anymore. Most of this due to compatibility reasons. A large portion of this video will go over the titles on the Nintendo Switch Online service, but there are titles in the Nintendo Switch's own library that will also have some compatibility issues with the Switch 2. And vice versa. Let's start with the obvious here, and that is the Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2 are not compatible with any controllers from previous systems. I know. Crazy, right? This is obviously a very common theme for new systems, where unless your controller ends in a USB port, it's not likely to be compatible with any other system, especially with Nintendo. There are some exceptions though, like the Wii was compatible with the GameCube controllers, Wii U was compatible with Wii controllers, and yes, the Switch 2 is compatible with most of the Switch 1 controllers. More on that later. This means you cannot connect a classic Nintendo Entertainment System controller to your Switch 2. It just doesn't work. And that compatibility issue actually presents a lot of problems for the games available on the Nintendo Switch Online service. Like, for more than I expected before I started researching for this video. Starting off with games available on the Nintendo Entertainment System service, there's not a lot of games on this list that had its content locked away. Every game that released on the original system had all of its content accessible on the cartridge, from what I was able to find, and that is mostly true for the games currently available on the Nintendo Switch. However, the Switch's lack of classic controller support does negatively impact some of the games here. Not so much for the Nintendo Entertainment System, but for its Japanese counterpart, the Famicom. The second player controller for the Famicom system has a microphone built into it. Not a lot of games utilize this, though more than I expected, to be honest, but there are a few notable games on the Switch service that would use this. The first of which is The Legend of Zelda. As you traverse through the game, you'll encounter an enemy called Pole's Voice, and the way you defeat them differs between versions. This is common knowledge to most gamers at this point. Non-Famicom versions of the game had you defeat Pole's Voice by attacking them with arrows, and the Japanese original had you defeat them by yelling into the microphone on the second player controller. So how does that work for the Famicom Online service? Well, it doesn't. Die. Die. Go away now. Am I not in the right room? Die. Go. Why is this not working? The Nintendo Switch 2 is fully compatible with a USB microphone, but it's meant for the chat service Nintendo provides that no one uses. And at the launch of the Switch 2, the Switch 1 was updated so it could also use a USB microphone for this service. However, the microphone does not seem to be functional with any games that are not specifically looking for it. This means that Japanese players, or those with access to the Japanese games, cannot use the microphone as it was originally intended. Luckily, there is a workaround here, at least for Zelda. It seems Nintendo is very much aware of Pole's Voice, as every time they release Zelda on a system that doesn't have a microphone, they give the game special functions that allow you to still defeat the enemies. For the Nintendo Switch version specifically, this method is pressing both the R triggers or both the L triggers until the Pole's Voice just disappear. Unfortunately, this method does not seem to be universal. Another game that utilized the microphone is Mirror of Palutena, otherwise known to English players as Kid Icarus. Starting from the second level of World 1, you'll come across these shop owners. In English versions, you can hold down the A and B buttons on the second controller to get the shop owner to lower his prices. That is, if Pit is a higher experience level than whatever world level he's on, as the shop owner will otherwise just get mad and raise his prices instead. In the Japanese game, the second player needs to hold the A button and yell into the microphone to accomplish this effect. Lower your prices. Drop your prices. Lower them. Hello. While Zelda had a workaround for Pole's Voice, the same can't be said for Kid Icarus. I tried the same method Zelda uses and all sorts of other button combinations, but nothing was working, which means you cannot haggle the shop owner in the Japanese version of Kid Icarus. Several other games also utilize the microphone on the Famicom service, but information on how it works and any workarounds, if they exist, seem to not be that well documented online, mainly due to popularity it seems. Nintendo did recreate the main controllers for the systems on their online service, and this does include Famicom controllers, which interestingly does have a microphone in the second player controller. I don't have these controllers myself, so I can't test them, but if this microphone does work, then that's honestly a little bit weird, as it would otherwise be the only compatible microphone for the Nintendo Switch systems as a whole outside of game chat. That is, assuming it works with anything else. The lack of microphone support for older titles may negatively impact games that can release later on down the line, such as Nintendo 64's Hey You Pikachu, which uses a microphone to do literally anything, and the GameCube Mario Party 6 and 7, which uses a microphone for some minigames and some side modes. Unless Nintendo adjusts the coding of those games on how they read a microphone, should they decide to release them at all, we may run into some compatibility problems. Sticking with the theme of yet-to-be-released games, the microphone isn't the only problem the Switch Online service faces, as there are other games we have yet to get that rely on other controller peripherals. Some of the most well-known peripherals for the NES and Famicom were the Zapper and the Power Glove. My hand doesn't even fit in it, man. The Zapper people know as a ways to shoot ducks in the game Duck Hunt, and the Power Glove people know from that one scene in The Wizard.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
While neither of these controllers are compatible with the Nintendo Switch systems, they're actually fairly easy to emulate. In fact, Nintendo's done that already. Duck Hunt was re-released on the Wii's Virtual Console service, where instead of the Zapper, players used the Wii Remote sensor to aim at the ducks. The Power Glove was mainly used for the game Super Glove Ball, which has never been re-released. It was made by Rare, the same people who made games like Donkey Kong Country and Banjo-Kazooie, so there may be some licensing issues there, but both the Zapper and the Super Glove could be very easily emulated with the Switch or Switch 2 Joy-Cons, if the Super Mario Galaxy ports, Zelda Skyward Sword HD, and Epic Mickey Rebrushed are any indication, unless Nintendo decides to also just recreate the Zapper and Super Glove controllers. That'd be cool. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color games are similar to the NES ones, where most of the content is just already available. They even modified Kirby Tilt and Tumble to work with Joy-Con motion controls. I'm not very good at it though. Two Game Boy games, Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, had a special connection to their Nintendo 64 counterparts, where by using a transfer pack you can unlock content between the pairs of games. The Nintendo Switch does not use the transfer pack, but for the Game Boy version specifically, there is good news. Connecting the two Mario Tennises would unlock additional characters and minigames in the Game Boy version, and on the Nintendo Switch, all of that content is just already available. The Game Boy version of Mario Golf, though, really only allowed you to see your scores from the Nintendo 64 version, which is not a thing here on the Nintendo Switch, but I don't think we're missing much. For something we're truly missing out on, when I was looking through the list of Game Boy games on the Switch Online service, the Pokémon trading card game has this little tag that says limited edition Pokémon card inside. We can't get that anymore. Where's our limited edition Pokémon card, Nintendo? We're not done talking about the Game Boy yet, though, as there are some games that have yet to be released that rely on certain other accessories. A couple of these being the Game Boy camera and the Game Boy printer. We're likely not going to see a re-release of the Game Boy camera features anytime soon, as the camera itself was kind of an application of its own. It let you take pictures, and then add special effects, and there were even some minigames. It is possible for it to work on Nintendo Switch though, as, like with the microphone, camera functionality was added to both systems for use with the Game Chat application. So by using a standard USB camera, Nintendo could make the Game Boy camera function on the Game Boy's Nintendo Switch Online service. I don't see why they would want to though, as the image quality would be even grainier than the ones Nintendo's own cameras produce now. The Game Boy printer is never going to happen again, as the Switch isn't compatible with any printer at all. They let you print out special graphics from certain games, one of these being a series that doesn't have any core titles on the Switch Online service yet, Pokémon. We got FireRed and LeafGreen as standalone games earlier this year, but none of the other mainline Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games have been made available yet. It's not like it'd be impossible, as they were re-released for the 3DS back in the day, and were even modified to work with wireless communication for trading and battling. A big reason I think for why these games haven't come out yet is likely due to Pokémon Home. The Home application is essentially an online storage service that lets you upload your captured Pokémon into a cloud storage system. The Switch versions of FireRed and LeafGreen were made to be compatible with Pokémon Home, and it was probably a test run to see how well they do. Because of the existence of the Home service, it'd be more likely to see the other Pokémon titles as standalone re-releases rather than through the Switch Online service. Moving on to the Nintendo Entertainment System, there are games I immediately wanted to test out, those being Mario Paint and Mario & Wario. Both games can only be played by using the Super NES mouse, which Mario's Paint image card says it comes with along with a mouse pad. Just another physical item we're not getting. These games were released due to the Switch 2's Joy-Cons having a mouse ability. where if you turn the controller on its side, the mouse sensor will kick in. I first tried this during my playthrough of Metroid Prime 4, and it actually works fairly well, despite being a little bit crampy because of how I had to hold it. And it works just fine with Mario Paint and Mario & Wario on the Switch too. But these games are also available on the first Nintendo Switch, whose Joy-Cons do not have mouse functionality. Instead, you need to plug in a USB mouse to the system, and it's... okay. The mouse speed is pretty slow, but it does function. Just look at my beautiful abomination. On the Switch 2, you can play the game in handheld mode, as the Joy-Cons are wireless and work just fine. On the Switch 1, you need to have a mouse that ends in a USB-C port, which is a different connection than when the system is docked. Personally, I had a USB 3.0 to USB-C adapter, and the Switch picked it up just fine. You can't prop the system up because the connector is in the way, but you can use a mouse on the Switch 1 in handheld mode. It's the most optimal way to play, honestly. Similar to the NES, the SNES has a few games that haven't been released because of certain controller peripherals being needed. One of these games, Yoshi's Safari, is in a similar situation as Duck Hunt, where it also used a light gun controller, this case being the Super Scope. Unlike Duck Hunt, Yoshi's Safari was never re-released, even on the Wii, but it could utilize the same Joy-Con motion sensor capabilities I mentioned earlier. And we also have a strange case where a game was actually removed from the Super Nintendo lineup. Super Soccer initially released for the Nintendo Switch Online service back in 2019, before being removed in 2025. I'm not entirely sure why this happened, information isn't clear and it might have something to do with licensing, but it's a good example of the dangers of online preservation and the chances of content being removed for various reasons on streaming services. Personally, I think it's a good thing we got Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen as standalone titles and not on the Game Boy Advance online service, as people who downloaded them can still play it whenever the Nintendo Switch Online service goes down. But if you're someone who currently exists on a day after March 28, 2025, you are not able to play Super Soccer on the Nintendo Switch. We also have Sega Genesis games on the Nintendo Switch Online service, which is honestly not that surprising in this day. I don't have a lot of experience with these games, as I never owned a Genesis growing up or had any other access to these games until now, so I'm very unfamiliar with any additional controllers or bonus content. The internet tells me there are things like a Capcom Fighter Power Stick meant for fighting games, the Sega Mega Mouse for use with Mario Paint clones, and something called the Sega Genesis Activator, which was this octagon you sat on the floor, and it would read your movements as inputs. It didn't do very well. When it comes to games on the Switch with now inaccessible content, certain Genesis games are a bit weird. Some Sega Genesis games had the ability to transfer content from one game to another, done by plugging one cartridge directly into another cartridge that allowed for this special connection. And since there's no physical cartridge for the games on the Nintendo Switch services, this ability to connect games together just can't happen. The version of Mega Man The Wily Wars on the Genesis service is actually the 3 games compiled into one, in order to properly transfer content from one game to the next like you would on the original Genesis. So that's neat. The only main Sonic game on the service right now is Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and it has an inter-cartridge connection with Sonic & Knuckles, which is not currently on the service at the time of me recording this. If you combine Sonic & Knuckles with any of the other main 3 Sonic games, you'd get to play as Knuckles in that game and unlock other bonus content. As it stands now, the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 game does not feature this bonus content with Knuckles, but they could release an updated version of the game, as well as the other games down the line. And then we get to the point where the content gets a little bit messy. The Nintendo 64 and Nintendo GameCube had ways to connect to their handheld counterparts, which the Nintendo Switch just does not allow for. And it will honestly just get worse the more games we get, to the point where unless Nintendo releases peripherals of their own that connect to the actual physical Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, the future is looking a little rough. The Nintendo 64 controller is very unique, where it has an extra port on the bottom of the controller itself that allowed for extra attachments. The most popular of these being things like the memory pack, the rumble pack, and the transfer pack. The memory pack and rumble pack aren't too big of an issue right now, as most games just provide memory to the system or the game itself rather than an additional memory card, and the rumble feature is in most controllers nowadays just innately. But the transfer pack is especially unique as it allowed connection between Nintendo 64 games and Game Boy Color games, which is something Nintendo Switch has not been able to emulate yet. Nintendo did re-release the Nintendo 64 controller for the Nintendo Switch, but it lacks the connection port at the bottom, preventing any accessories from being used. I talked about the Game Boy versions of Mario Tennis and Mario Golf earlier, but now it's time to go over the Nintendo 64 versions. The Game Boy games had special story modes with unique characters, like Alex, who is my favorite for obvious reasons. By using a transfer pack, you are able to actually bring these story characters to the 64 games, complete with any stat boosts and upgrades you would have acquired through the story. The Nintendo 64 Mario Tennis would also get additional character-themed tennis courts if you connected it to the Game Boy version. Because the new version of the Nintendo 64 controller lacks the accessory port, transferring these characters to the console version is impossible. Even though both pairs of the games are available on the Game Boy and 64 services, there is no way to connect them to each other. Let me see Alex in 3D, Nintendo, please, I beg you. And while we don't have any core Pokemon titles on the Game Boy application, we do have Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Stadium 2 for the Nintendo 64 application, as well as Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness for the GameCube application. All three of these games were originally compatible with the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance Pokemon titles, where you could actually transfer Pokemon from the handhelds to see them come to life in 3D. In the Pokemon Stadium titles, you could even play the Game Boy Pokemon games directly on your TV. It was super cool, and it's unfortunately not something we can do anymore. All Pokemon titles on the Switch Online applications also lack connectivity to Pokemon Home, which means any Pokemon you catch will be locked to whatever game you catch them in, due to also lacking any transferable means between each other. There are other games on the Nintendo 64 not currently on the Switch Online application that also use the transfer pack to connect to its Game Boy counterpart, and if any of them released on the service, their content would also be locked behind an impossible requirement. There is one game I found that does take the lack of Game Boy connection issue into account, being Perfect Dark. By connecting the Game Boy version to the Nintendo 64 version, it would unlock 4 cheats that would normally otherwise be unlocked by completing difficult missions. The Perfect Dark on the mature version of the Nintendo 64 application has these cheats unlocked immediately. So even though the cheats could have still been unlocked naturally through the game anyway, it's nice to see the developers considered the lack of a Game Boy connection for the Nintendo Switch. There are also Nintendo 64 games that have content locked away that would have utilized something other than a transfer pack. The Nintendo 64 DD was a disk drive add-on for the Nintendo 64 that would play floppy disk-like games and offer expansions to certain cartridge titles. Very few games utilize this system, and even fewer are on the Nintendo Switch Online service. One game that did get an expansion through the 64 DD was F-Zero X, called the F-Zero X Expansion Kit, which allowed you to create your own vehicles and even your own racetracks. It also unlocked a musical remix for the Rainbow Road course. The 64 DD never released outside of Japan, so the American and European versions of F-Zero X wouldn't have this data, but not even the Japanese version of F-Zero X through the Switch Online service has access to this content. The ability to make your own machines was brought over into F-Zero GX, and the racetrack creation was in F-Zero Climax, but the game that had it to begin with just isn't available on Nintendo Switch. How about something that was cut from a game, made available later, just to be cut again? The Nintendo 64 version of Banjo-Kazooie had a scrapped feature called Stop and Swap, which was meant to transfer specific items to its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, as well as to a few other games developed by Rare. Because the Nintendo 64 system itself ended up getting revised during Banjo-Kazooie's development, it impacted how the transfer worked and the mode was scrapped entirely. When Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie were released through the Xbox Live Arcade for the Xbox 360, the Stop and Swap mode was reworked and fully implemented for both games, and was even compatible with Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts. Because the versions of Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie on the Nintendo Switch are the original Nintendo 64 versions, the Stop and Swap mode is once again completely non-functional. It could probably even work on the Switch system nowadays, but as you probably noticed, Nintendo seems to have a habit of not connecting games together. You can collect some of the items needed for Stop and Swap, but they serve no purpose as you're not capable of transferring them. And as for the Xbox Live Arcade was another online service that launched back in 2004. It ran for 20 years, being discontinued for the Xbox 360 in 2024, but you can still purchase the Xbox 360 versions of Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie separately on the current Xbox systems, which both have the Stop and Swap mode enabled. Microsoft does what Nintendo don't, I guess. I also noticed the game box used for the Nintendo 64 service for Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask had a label called Collector's Edition on it. I looked up what this meant, and apparently it just distinguishes the difference between a holographic and non-holographic label on the cartridge, with the Collector's Edition being the holographic one. Wow, no Pokemon card, no NES mouse and mouse pad, and now no holographic game cartridge? You're slacking, Nintendo. When it comes to games on the Game Boy Advance, there's not a lot of games that has its content locked away. Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3, was originally compatible with the e-reader, a card scanning peripheral that unlocked content based on what cards you scanned, and scanning cards unlocked whole new levels in this game. Only a handful of these cards released in America, but when the game was re-released through the Wii U Virtual Console, all of the e-reader levels were made available, and this version of the game was also made available for the Nintendo Switch Online service. The Japanese version of F-Zero GP Legend also used e-reader cards to unlock things like bonus machines or tracks, and for its release on Nintendo Switch, all of its content was also made immediately available. These are cases where all data otherwise unobtainable on the Nintendo Switch were made available, but other games are not so lucky. The English version of Fire Emblem Blazing Sword had additional weapons and items that could be obtained by connecting it to the Mario Kart Double Dash bonus disc on the GameCube. In Japan, these items were obtained by visiting certain Nintendo kiosks. No methods exist elsewhere. Not only is Mario Kart Double Dash not yet available on the Switch 2's GameCube application, but it is very unlikely the bonus disc will also be released there, and the Japanese kiosks don't support Nintendo Switch Online games to my knowledge. Which means this bonus content is just not available on Nintendo Switch. The Japanese-only Fire Emblem The Binding Blade was also able to connect to a Japanese copy of Blazing Sword, which allowed Japanese players to skip Lin's story entirely, and also unlock 2 additional end scenes. Both of these scenes were made available at the end of the English version, though no method to skip Lin's story existed elsewhere. Well, now Japanese players can suffer along with the rest of us, as Lin's story is now mandatory for them on the Nintendo Switch with no method to skip it. I hope they enjoy 11 chapters of tutorials. And finally, we have Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team. We got a remake of it for the Nintendo Switch titled Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX, which had various quality of life changes and the content from both Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team wrapped up into one game. For the Nintendo Switch Online, we only have the Red Rescue Team on the Game Boy Advance application. Blue Rescue Team is a Nintendo DS game, and there's no DS application for the Nintendo Switch as of this recording. That means, as it stands now, the original Red Rescue Team cannot receive or send any transfer content to or from Blue Rescue Team. Even if we do get a DS application down the line and it gets Blue Rescue Team, it's very unlikely the 2 games will be able to connect to each other given Nintendo's current track record. And if so, that means Blue Rescue Team will also be lacking in some content. Remember how I said the Nintendo Switch can't use any older controllers? Well, I lied. Kind of. Back in 2014, Nintendo released an adapter for the Wii U that allowed it to connect to Nintendo GameCube controllers. Back then, this was exclusively meant for Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, but with the Nintendo Switch, it was expanded to be able to be used for just about any Switch game due to its USB port. However, this adapter is only formatted to be used with GameCube controllers and certain other GameCube accessories, but not the GameCube to Game Boy Advance link cable that allows you to connect the Game Boy Advance to the GameCube. A year ago, literally the day after the Nintendo Switch 2 launched, I posted a video that showed the Nintendo Switch 2's lack of connection with the Game Boy Advance. At the time of that video, the only game on the Nintendo GameCube service that used the Game Boy Advance connection was The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, showing its lack of ability to connect with the Tingle Tuner item. In the year that followed, we got more GameCube games with more problems. Rather than go over each game individually like I did with the Wind Waker, I thought I'd just compile everything in one big video to go over everything the Switch and Switch 2 cannot do. I hope you've been enjoying it so far, because there's still a lot more to cover. As of right now, the Nintendo Switch 2 is still not capable of reading a Game Boy Advance with the Game Boy Advance to GameCube link cable. For most games, this was mainly just a way to unlock additional content or engage in some second-player activities. I already covered the lack of connection for the Wind Waker, Pokémon XD, as well as a future problem for Fire Emblem. Along with Wind Waker and Pokémon XD, 2 other games currently on the GameCube application utilize the Game Boy Advance connection: Wario World and Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. For Wario World, after you collect all the treasures in a level, you could connect the Game Boy Advance to play demos of minigames from WarioWare Incorporated Mega Micro Games. For Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, connecting it to a copy of Fire Emblem's Binding Blade, Blazing Sword, or Sacred Stones on the Game Boy Advance will unlock special galleries relating to the characters in those games. None of this content is present on the Switch 2. Pokémon Colosseum, the game that predates Pokémon XD, was announced and would also utilize transfers between GBA Pokémon games, but it's very likely not going to happen once it releases on the Switch 2. There are other GameCube games Nintendo can release that use the Game Boy Advance connection. We don't have Mario Tennis Power Tour and Mario Golf Advance Tour on the Game Boy Advance application yet, but they'd be in a similar situation to the other Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games we covered earlier, where they'd lack certain content and the ability to transfer characters to their GameCube counterparts. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle used the Game Boy Advance to send Chao to a special garden, and Animal Crossing used the Game Boy Advance to unlock additional content and give the player an exclusive island that can update the GameCube title. All of this content will very likely be locked away due to the heavy reliance on a second screen. We also have a case of a GameCube remake removing content that would be unlocked through a Game Boy Advance. Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion were both released in 2002 for the GameCube and Game Boy Advance respectively, and connecting the 2 of them together would result in some bonus content. By connecting Metroid Prime to Metroid Fusion at any point, you'd be able to play the original Metroid game on the Game Boy Advance. We can already play Metroid on the NES application, so I don't consider that lost media. But if you connect the games after beating Metroid Prime at least once, you'd unlock Samus's fusion suit for use in Metroid Prime, which was purely aesthetic. Metroid Prime was re-released on the Nintendo Switch as a standalone title called Metroid Prime Remastered in 2023, which improved the graphics, mechanics, and quality of life functions from the original game. However, due to the lack of connectivity to the Game Boy Advance, the Fusion Suit bonus was removed from the remaster and no alternative ways were made available to unlock it. There are a couple of GameCube games that relied heavily on the Game Boy Advance as part of its core function. One of these titles, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, was remade for the Nintendo Switch back in 2020, where instead of Game Boy Advances for each player controller, it required players to have their own copy of the game in order to display individual statistics. I don't know if that's a better trade-off or not, but we can at least properly play the game. The other title that used the Game Boy Advance as a controller was The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords Adventures. Like Crystal Chronicles, you could play Four Swords Adventures single player, where everything would just be displayed on the television. But for multiplayer, you had to use individual screens. I hope Four Swords Adventures gets the remake treatment like Crystal Chronicles did, because it wouldn't work on the Switch 2 otherwise. Even if 4 players had access to the GameCube service, the game, as it is built, would not distribute information properly. That's it for the GameCube games that use the Game Boy Advance, but there are titles that could have trouble with just the GameCube on its own. F-Zero GX doesn't exactly have missing content, but the way to unlock it is different nowadays. The game released alongside an arcade version called F-Zero AX, and by taking your GameCube memory card with F-Zero GX data on it and plugging it into the AX console, you'd unlock bonus machine parts, characters, and courses in GX depending on your achievements in the AX version. The AX arcade was pretty scarce back then, even more so today, and the Switch 2 isn't compatible with any GameCube memory cards anyway. The good news is F-Zero AX content can be unlocked naturally in GX, even in the original game. It's just all locked behind some pretty difficult requirements. So difficult that I think you'd have an easier time hunting down the original AX arcade machine and playing that here in 2026. This next bit of information is about the Nintendo GameCube controller itself, particularly its shoulder buttons. The Nintendo GameCube has two shoulder buttons, each with their own analog function, where depending on how hard you press them down, a different function will happen. This is something unique to the Nintendo GameCube controller as far as I know, Nintendo or otherwise, and it's something the Nintendo Switch has some trouble replicating. Nintendo did remake the Nintendo GameCube controller once the Nintendo Switch 2 launched, but none of the actual Nintendo Switch controllers have that analog function on their Joy-Cons or Pro Controllers or whatever, which can make playing GameCube games a little awkward. To be clear, regular Switch controllers can use the analog function even if the individual shoulder buttons don't have that functionality. Instead, they operate as if you are lightly pressing a GameCube trigger, and if you press the other paired shoulder button, it will act as a hard press. The only game on the GameCube service right now where this makes a difference is Luigi's Mansion, and I'll use that to explain. Pressing either the L or ZL button on its own results in Luigi just lightly sending out the element he has. But while holding one of those buttons down and then also pressing the other one, the hard press is activated and Luigi will shoot out an elemental ball. With me so far? This works well enough with Luigi's Mansion, but it might not translate well for other games. For example, Super Mario Sunshine has been announced for the service, and it's a game we've already experienced some problems with. When it came with Mario 64 and Mario Galaxy in the Super Mario 3D All-Stars bundle, players immediately noticed bugs with graphics, controllers, and leftover developer assets. This one bundle I believe was used to test how these older games work, as we didn't get the Nintendo 64 application, GameCube remakes, or Wii ports until after this bundle came out. Super Mario Sunshine uses the R trigger to use FLUDD, and the way you use it depends on how hard you press the trigger down. By lightly tapping the R trigger, you are able to run with FLUDD, while holding it down all the way will allow you to stop and be able to aim. Super Smash Bros. Melee also uses the trigger sensitivity for the character shields, with how hard you press determining how strong the shield becomes. The Switch controllers can emulate this, as it's the L bumper that determines the sensitivity of the ZL and ZR triggers, but it would be quite awkward to have to press two buttons to perform one action. So if you're someone playing GameCube games without a GameCube controller, I am sorry. The games on the Nintendo Switch Online service have a lot of problems. Like, way more than they reasonably should. It's understandable why some of them do. They're a product of their time and they utilize controllers or features that Nintendo Switch is just not capable of emulating. But then there's games that just have content locked in their original releases, and it seems to be a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to what the Nintendo Switch is capable of making available. And it doesn't really bode well for future releases. The next pair of consoles that are set to be released later on down the line are the Wii and the Nintendo DS, and they both come with their own set of issues. The Switch lacks a touchscreen when it's docked, and games that utilize the connection between both consoles, like Pokémon Battle Revolution for example, would just probably, very likely, not be emulated on the Nintendo Switch. But we're not done yet. We've been covering a lot of the past titles from the Nintendo Switch Online service, but now it's time to cover the Nintendo Switch line itself. The Nintendo Switch 2 was made to be a bigger, more powerful version of the Nintendo Switch, and with a change of size and performance, comes some compatibility complications. As if they expected me to make this video, Nintendo has a comprehensive list of Switch 1 games and accessories that are and are not compatible with the Switch 2. Games like Ring Fit Adventure and Nintendo Switch Sports use exercising accessories that the Switch 2 Joy-Cons are not compatible with. Games like Everybody 1-2 Switch and WarioWare Move It utilize the IR motion camera on the original right-hand Joy-Con that the Switch 2 Joy-Con lacks. And any Labo kit that uses the Switch 1 Joy-Cons or the Switch 1 screen itself cannot use the Switch 2 system. All of these accessories and games can technically be played on the Switch 2, you just have to use Switch 1 Joy-Cons to use them, except for those that utilize the Nintendo Switch screen like the Labo VR, Fishing Rod, or House Sets. Switch 1 Joy-Cons and other controllers are capable of being used by the Switch 2, but any that would attach to the Switch 1 or related controller accessories cannot attach to the Switch 2 and vice versa. The dock, AC adapter, HDMI cable, and microSD cards that the Switch 1 could use cannot be used by the Switch 2 due to differing power requirements and vice versa. And of course, the most obvious, Switch 2 exclusive games cannot be played on the Switch 1, though any game marked as Nintendo Switch 2 Edition can be played on either system. It's just that playing that game on a Switch 1 would disable any Switch 2 specific enhancements. Additionally, many Wii U games were ported to the Nintendo Switch, and most of those had to be adjusted to account for the new single-screen system. Some of these games had their content adjusted or removed from the Switch versions. And I don't just mean Spot Pass and Miiverse connectivity. In New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, Toadette joins the roster of playable characters for the main game, replacing Blue Toad. Blue Toad can be selected by replacing Yellow Toad, but the two Toads are not capable of being played together. Captain Toad Treasure Tracker on the Wii U had levels based on Super Mario 3D World, but for its release on Nintendo Switch as well as Nintendo 3DS, those levels were replaced by ones inspired by Super Mario Odyssey. And while Super Mario Maker 2 isn't a port of the first Super Mario Maker, it does remove the Mystery Mushroom item, which transformed Mario into various characters and was a well-liked item by the community because it gave people a reason to use their amiibo. And speaking of amiibo, I feel like Nintendo just hasn't been focusing much on them as of late. Yes, we're still getting new releases of amiibo themselves, but the utilization of them on the Switch 2 has just been either underwhelming or non-existent. Mario Kart 8, both its Wii U original and the deluxe port on Switch, allowed you to scan amiibo to unlock new costumes for the Miis. Not only does Mario Kart World on the Switch 2 lack Miis, but it would have been a fun way to unlock costumes for other characters. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom lacks the ability to summon Wolf Link like Breath of the Wild could, and the amiibo for Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4 only provide health and ammunition, as well as unlocking music in the overworld of Prime 4. Scanning amiibo in Mario Tennis Fever would unlock balls. Balls! I've been a fan of Nintendo my entire life, and I love playing these games both old and new. But playing these games again that I've been experiencing for the past 30 years anew on the Nintendo Switch just tells me we're never going to get the same experience for these games ever again. Sure, a majority of the games on the Nintendo Switch are fully functional with no issues. Most games ported to the Switch or released on the online service have been adjusted or remade to account for the different system. But Nintendo is such a unique company with unique games that they end up being a little too unique for their own good. From games needing a certain controller to function properly, to console interconnectivity that just cannot be done again, we're running into more problems than we realistically should be. Most, if not all, of these games still have the data within them, locked away, never to be seen again, except for on the original console they released on. For games like Mario Tennis on Nintendo 64 or Fire Emblem on the Game Boy Advance, they could have made the extra content immediately available, and games like Wind Waker will need another revision of the GameCube controller adapter to be able to read a Game Boy Advance. I love having all these classic games in one place, but we'll never get all of them. And some consoles just raise more complications than rewarding experiences, like the Virtual Boy application, that you can't record direct footage of at all. This sucks. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching my video, I do really appreciate it. The Nintendo Switch 2 has come a long way in just its first year, but there's still a lot of problems that it would definitely need to fix. But I'm looking forward to what the future has to offer for this system, as well as the first Nintendo Switch 2, as that's still going strong. I tried to get as much as I could. This video took a lot of research and a lot of editing, so definitely give it a like, and definitely subscribe as well if you aren't already. I've also been streaming more on Twitch as well as here on YouTube, so definitely check those out as well. Links to everything I do in the description is down below. I tried to cover as much as I could, but if there's something I missed, definitely let me know, and let me know how your own experience with the Nintendo Switch 2 has been this past year. As always, thank you so much for watching. This video is over. Goodbye.